Klaus from IFPRI. I have a question. If all this makes so much common sense, why are we so far back?
Wants to take that, Tom?
I think the only response I can give to that is I heard, this was about 10 years ago, there was a speaker at an industry conference who was from the forest industry, I believe. And he was speaking about, well, he was speaking more about the spotted owl issue, and I don't really understand the full issue that he was talking about, but he says, you know, that was the strategy we had. We just expected common sense to break out. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen without an effort. But.
Luke?
What I would like to say to that is that, and I would like to make a comparison. When I was a student, I studied soil science. I'm a soil science graduate. And when you were a soil scientist, you were a soil scientist. And I did an additional degree in agronomy because I thought, well, soil science is one thing, but where is the connection?
Where is the connection with agriculture? What I'm trying to say is that when I studied at the university, we were all compartmentalized. When you see today, when we look at agriculture, we have soil scientists, agronomists, we have plant physiologists, we have the molecular biologists, we have biochemists, and all that is only now coming together. So it took a long time before we realized that we're all stakeholders in this. And I think one of the reasons it's coming together is because we are now concerned how efficient we are with our resource management. We have resources at our disposal. A lot of them are finite, and we need to manage them as well as we can. And with the advances in technology, I think we see all these disciplines coming together, and that's why we are making far more progress now than we made 30, 40 years ago. And I think that's very encouraging. Not exactly a reply to your question, Klaus, but I think that's at least gives you an indication of how the thinking was 30, 40 years ago and what the thinking is today.
Well, everybody's talking about silos these days, and these silos are about as high as the moon between health, nutrition, and agriculture. So I guess it's not to be expected to try to break down these silos and get them to combine together. Is not going to take a long time. But I think in the end, we need to start motivating our institutions of higher learning to form programs that will allow students that are interested or would become interested in linking agriculture to human health with the ability to get trained in multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary actions and coursework that would allow them to apply such training to these problems that have been so recalcitrant in the past to solve. We need to start training some students in this area that have the ability to do transdisciplinary research and work with people. Anyway, that's what I think.
Mm-hmm. Can I just actually now assert my role as a chair and follow up on Klaus's question in two ways. Ross, if you have been working in this area for 40 years, you mentioned, and you have industry here. I mean, what would you want industry to do that it is not doing today to make that link? And I'd like to turn around and ask Luc. Luc, what would you want to see the agriculture community or the health community from the fertilizer industry perspective do to incentivize or to motivate? You know, what would be on your wish list to try to break down these silos and to make much more efficient, or to come to that win-win-win that you were talking about? What do these sectors do differently, or what would you want them to do differently?
Well, I think that I would want the fertilizer industry to do with what they actually did, and that was start thinking about this and writing a book about this. This is very good. Pleases me greatly. That's certainly the first step. And beyond that, then it requires motivation of the industry to actually take it on board and do it. But,
fertilizer industry for a very long time, and a certain sector of the fertilizer industry is still struggling with that, saw itself as a commodity industry. We produce a commodity, we have a market for it, it leaves the factory gate, and that's it. And if there is a demand for something, then we produce it if we can, but don't ask us to be responsible for the product that we have manufactured. Those days have gone, fortunately. I wouldn't say that it was easy to convert the mindset of the fertilizer industry to take on the responsibility and to start thinking on what is happening to the products, where do they go and what do they do. But at least we are now in a stage where, as you can see, we start putting a book together, we start working together, we look at what it is that we can do, what the challenges are, and we see opportunities as a fertilizer industry. And as I said, probably not the entire fertilizer industry is behind me on that, but at least sufficient part of the industry realizes that and is willing to continue on that. So it is indeed a new mindset. The fertilizer industry starts thinking about its responsibility also, what the possibilities are in order to improve human health. But there is one thing that I would like to cite nevertheless, and that is that when we in the association started to think about the link between agriculture and human health, we did approach the World Health Organization because we thought, well, that's the institution that we need to talk to in order to go forward. And we were rather surprised that we were not really welcomed with open arms when we arrived there. And it took quite a bit of convincing from our part before the World Health Organization said, yes, we do see a role for the fertilizer industry to play in this context. So I think that change and how you manage change is always very difficult, and to change somebody's mind is not easy, but I think we're getting there. And as Ross has said, you know, we're on the way now, and we're putting things together, and we have some success stories, and we hope we can make a significant contribution to human health.
Thank you very much. Did you? No?
The one comment I would add, I guess, is that from an industry perspective, in looking at what do we need from the academic sector, from the universities, and I think it's a lot very similar to what Ross's comment was. We need less silos, more interdisciplinary collaborations that are targeted at the sustainability issues that face agriculture in general.
Thank you. I thought I saw hands over there. Marcia, can you, the gentleman in the middle, and then we come to Howdy, and then.
Hi there, very interesting presentation. My name is Bob Rabatsky. I'm with FinTrack, and we are an agriculture consultancy that works in many developing countries that frankly don't have a lot of access to fertilizer. I mean, we work with farmers who want fertilizer but can't get it. We talk to fertilizer companies, and they don't provide fertilizer because they don't have farmers who are demanding it. So it's a chicken-egg thing all along. I mean, I fully agree with you that this is a critical component that's lacking in the productivity of agriculture worldwide. My point is that it seems to me the presentation and the book are going to be really promoting fertilizer, 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 when I think the message ought to be, let's promote soil fertility, let's promote land stewardship. For instance, in the tropics, a big problem, even when you do have fertilizer, is leaching of fertilizer because there's no organic matter in the soil. So incorporating organic matter, you know, wholesale approaches to improving soil fertility. I think that this book would be much more powerful if you came at it from that approach.
Thank you. Why don't you pass the mic in front of you, if you allow? I'll take 2 or 3 comments from this side and then give you a chance to respond. Howdy.
Yeah, howdy, Boas from IFPRI and Harvest Plus. I think one of the reasons that it's so difficult to get agriculture and nutrition together is that there are long lag times. When you try to get donors to give, and you tell them that it's going to take between 5 and 10 years to do the research and have the impact, it's very hard to get support. What's interesting is that so far it's the agricultural donors that have been willing to support these efforts to some extent, private industry, but it's been very hard to get the nutrition and health donors to contribute to a nutrition and health objective. So we, at our conference last week, we talked a lot about, well, what does it take to get from here to there? And I think the main thing is to have successes, to show successes where you are improving health and nutrition. And then that'll feed on itself. So having the examples of the iodine in the water in China, having the examples of the selenium in Finland, I think they go a long way to convincing people to, you know, pursue those strategies, and you show they have a high benefit cost ratio, and that just feeds on itself. So sorry, that was a comment rather than a question, but.
Thank you. And we'll take the last comment on this side from Guillaume at the back. Yeah. And then I'll come to this side in a moment.
Yes, sorry. Thank you. My name is Guillaume Gruer. I work here at IFPRI. I'm a researcher. And I had two short questions. One is, can any of you talk a little bit about development in nano-fertilizers or nanoscale application of fertilizer? Does it has any future? How do you see it going? Here we are just interested in, you know, prospecting what could happen with those technologies. The second one is for the last speaker about sustainable agriculture. I wonder, you know, you said there is, you know, in the sustainable agriculture definition, there's not this health component, and you're definitely right. But I recently went to a conference where there was a lot of, you know, folks involved in what they call sustainable agriculture production system, and they always said, yes, it's related to health because we have diverse food production systems. So it's against monoculture. That's what we want. We want diversity. Then we want organic fertilizer. So my question is, you know, what can you say about what they think is, you know, a satisfying system, a sustainable system in terms of health? Is this wrong or bad, or what is good and bad?
Thank you. Let's take the round over here, and then I'll come there.
Yes, I'll address the question on nanotechnology. One of the things that I haven't mentioned is that within this context of rethinking where we're going in the fertilizer industry, an important aspect of that is thinking outside the box. And there is an initiative, it's called the VFRC, Virtual Fertilizer Research Center. It's an initiative developed by IFDC. It's chaired by Jimmy Cheek, who is the Chancellor of University of Kentucky, I guess. Yes. What this Virtual Fertilizer Research Center is supposed to do, no, I'm sorry, Jimmy Cheek is the Chancellor of the University of Tennessee. What this Virtual Fertilizer Research Center is supposed to do is to think, what is it that we can do? What is there outside the current practice in fertilizers that could be that could lead to the next generation of fertilizers? And nanotechnology is one of the aspects that is being looked at. It's being studied, it's being practiced in research conditions, but is something that is definitely promising to lead to a new generation of fertilizers.
I guess I'll try to address the first question, which related to the impression that the book is all about fertilizer, and I appreciate the comment, because certainly that isn't our intent. It is the management of plant nutrition that we're all about, and part of that is recognizing what can be made available from the soil, and that certainly there are many other factors that affect a soil's productivity, and the importance of organic matter we certainly do support and agree with. At the same time, recognizing that for systems to be productive and for us to be able to support the human population on Earth, we need to be looking at maintaining the soil fertility. And simply, there's a very simple rule: is what you take out has been diminished from soil fertility, and if you're going to maintain that soil fertility, you have to find a way of getting it back. It doesn't always have to be mineral fertilizers. We encourage, in an integrated plant nutrition approach, certainly making use of what's available on the farm and what's sort of available nearby in terms of organic sources. But in general, we would still have to put forward that supporting the current world population and the projected future world population will simply not be possible without external inputs. And that is something that that we will need to be getting across as well.
In respect to sustainable agriculture question, You know, in my mind, the very first thing that any definition of sustainable agriculture should start with is that it's an agriculture that sustains the health and well-being of the societies it produces food for. That should be the first definition, not down the line. It's number one: sustain our health, and that's what I want to see when people talk about sustainable agriculture. Not that everything else they say is not important, but they got it upside down. It always, at the very end, you read, oh well, yeah, and have nutritious food at the end of the definition. I think it should be the first thing in any definition.
Let me come over to the side of the room. They've been very patient. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is David Tardif-Douglin. I'm an agricultural economist with DAI, a consulting firm here in Washington. And a question I'd have for you, primarily for Dr. Maene, but I think for all three of you. Thank you very much for your presentation. But we saw the numbers on fertilizer use in Africa, and they're obviously very low in sub-Saharan Africa. I guess the question is two-part. What do you see as a primary reason, or maybe the top 5 reasons for such low fertilizer use? And secondly, what are you seeing in terms of trend for fertilizer use in the past 5 or so years?
Well, let me take, Luke, let me take several rounds from here, okay? Shengen, you had your hand up, and then Suresh.
Well, I'm Shengen Fen from IFPRI. Well, I think it's really a good discussion about making that link from a fertilizer to health and nutrition. So maybe it's a baby step, but it's a good beginning. I have not heard about the impact of fertilizer use on climate change, and then comes back to affect the people's health. So that's one comment I have to the experts here in the panel. The second is, yes, indeed, why we have not made that link stronger. One is partly lack of knowledge. You do have knowledge, but that knowledge has not been disseminated to broad audience. That's number one. Number two is a policy. Yes, you do have all these different pieces, ad hoc information from one piece towards health and nutrition. But do we have a comprehensive approach to move towards policy making? For example, if certain components of nutrients will contribute better to health than others, obviously this value has not been reflected by market, by prices. Can public policy change that to make sure that the input use will be socially optimal, not just economically optimal? So moving from purely technology to price, market, and policy.
Thank you. And Suresh?
Thank you, Rajul. Suresh Babu from IFPRI. Very useful presentations. And just to start with this malaria fertilizer association graph that you had, correlation graph, we need to be a little bit cautious, because I saw Malawi on top of that corner, where fertilizer use is very low but high rate of malaria. I would suggest that we take that one step further and look in Malawi, for example, where I worked for a number of years, that we found that malaria, as the incidence of malaria doesn't have, it doesn't differ between irrigated areas and non-irrigated low fertilizer application areas. So we need to be a bit careful about talking about the association and the causality. That's a comment. Second, coming to India, for example, a lot of small farmers now are against chemical fertilizer use. And if you go and talk in a farmers association, say organic agriculture is great and you should not use fertilizer, you'll become a hero overnight. And there are a lot of heroes like that. And partly because of that, the productivity that you showed is still lagging behind. We are very inefficient in using our nutrients, and we are not using right combinations of organic and inorganic fertilizers. And that comes back to what Shengen said. What are we doing as a community to educate the right combination of nutrient use and the soil fertility as a goal, rather than just application of chemical fertilizer? And we need to kind of change our strategies so that we increase our efficiency of use of input. And that's the second point I want to make. Thirdly, what Ross mentioned is really music to my ears, because we have been trying to combine agriculture, nutrition, and health community to develop the capacity not only in the developed countries, but also in developing countries, so that these issues can be comprehensively addressed at the policy level. But then we don't have the guidance in terms of what curriculum we need to have, what is the openness in terms of breaking the silos we talked about. We have not thought through, and that is a fundamental thing, to have a set of the capacity or the cadre of people who can talk like what we are talking right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did I miss? Yes. Marcia?
Thank you. I'd like to congratulate first the presenter, which excellent presentations. Jean Kamazi from the World Bank. I just want to build on one question which was raised about fertilizer and environment, which has an impact on public health. Are you exploring the area of fertilizer and food safety? Because I think this is another area which is very important. I think people need to have access to food, but if the food is not safe and rendering them sick, I think we have another problem. So I'm just wondering if you are looking at that aspect of food safety and fertilizer. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me turn over to the panel, but I too have a question on building on the success story, Ross. How far was the iodine example in China either continued or transferred to other villages in China? And I was just curious about that also, but all three of the panelists have questions and comments.
Shall I answer that one first? Unfortunately, DeLong showed in his studies with irrigation water and iodine that it only costs 11 cents per person a year to do, and one application lasted 5 years. Nobody's using it in China. I don't know for sure the reason. I've been told that it may be due to the fact that many people that are involved with iodine deficiency disorders sell iodized salt and iodine capsules. And is it capitalism that's failing there? I don't know. To me, if you have something that works and it's cheap and they're not using it, there's some reason for that. Anyway.
Okay. Are there questions and comments for all of you? Yeah.
Well, I will address the issue of fertilizer use in Africa. There is some good news, and the good news is that fertilizer use is slowly, too slow, but slowly improving in Africa. It's a question of access, it's a question of affordability, it's a lack of infrastructure. If you want me to sum up all the reasons why fertilizer is not readily available in Africa. And it's also, although this is changing now, it was also a lot of the governments in Africa, from a political point of view, from a policy point of view, were not putting enough priority on agricultural production. So for them it was not a priority. When I say it's changing, we see increased interest in producing fertilizers in Africa because there are natural resources available. Secondly, we see initiatives like developing corridors starting from ports all the way inland and developing markets, because I'm a firm believer that fertilizer use is not going to take off in Africa unless we can develop markets, input markets and output markets. So you have to bring in the fertilizer, but at the same time, because there you have resource poor farmers, once the farmer starts to produce more than he needs for his own families, we have to make sure that there is a mechanism in place so that he has access to an output market. So creating infrastructure, creating storage facilities, post-harvest technology that needs to be introduced. So this is something that the fertilizer industry cannot do alone. There are a lot of stakeholders involved, but from what I see today is that there is tremendous progress being made, and there are some countries that are really almost being showcases for that in that connection, and so I'm hopeful for Africa. But it will take some time before we really get where we are supposed to be. So it's a question of policy, it's a question of infrastructure, it's a question of making sure that farmers have access to fertilizer, and it's market development. That is what I firmly believe in. Now, just a side comment on India and on the farmers who are saying, well, we don't believe in chemical fertilizers, we want to use organic fertilizers. There again, we have a question of education. That's what we call this last mile delivery. How do we bring the tools that we have in our toolbox, how do we bring that to the farmers and explain to them what it is, what chemical fertilizers are and what the organic sources are that they have at their disposal. And what do we see? We see that in most countries, most developing countries, extension services have disappeared. So it's a daunting task. How do we bridge that last mile delivery? And a lot of the fertilizer industry and a lot of the companies actually take it upon themselves to develop programs to reach the farmers.
Luc, do you want to pick up on Schengen's point of policy and the role of policy, particularly in the African context also? As you mentioned, this is a time of some hope, some change. And how could you build in some of the policy aspects of health into the fertilizer aspect also?
It's a slow process. If you look back, we had the Fertilizer Summit in Abuja in 2006. And at the Fertilizer Summit in 2006, a number of commitments were made by the governments. One of the commitments was that fertilizer is a strategic commodity and therefore should be freely traded across the African continent. Now we are 2010 and even that has not been realized. So it's a very, very slow process. There's nothing more difficult than changing the policy climate in that respect. So we're working hard and we're making some progress, but you know, it will take time.
Tom?
Yeah, I picked out of the questions 3 that I thought I could make some comments on. One of the questions was greenhouse gases and their effect on human health. And yes, we did purposely, we reviewed, should we put the issue of greenhouse gases in a publication on fertilizer use in human health. And the reason we decided not to is that, well, yes, there are linkages, but they're quite indirect, they're quite future, and it's pretty hard to find a case of someone whose health has already been impacted by greenhouse gases. The second reason why we decided not to include anything is we have several other important industry initiatives that have been underway. Both IFA and IPNI have recent publications summarizing the role of fertilizers in the greenhouse gas issue. And admittedly, it's a very big issue for our industry, particularly nitrogen producers, because production of nitrogen involves the use of a lot of fossil fuels. The application of nitrogen is associated with an increase in emission of nitrous oxide, and those are our 2 key negatives. On the nitrous oxide, well, I should address them in order. In terms of the production of nitrogen fertilizers, there are companies that, and Yara is an example, that already have made efforts to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of the production of the fertilizers, and in Europe are now selling fertilizers on the basis of an actual numeric value as to how much CO2 equivalent was emitted per kilogram of fertilizer marketed. And that will continue, but I would have to put out that there are no known technologies out there that will make much of a significant reduction from the production technology we have at present. You might get a 10% improvement, but I don't think we'll get much further in the next, the foreseeable time frame. The second issue, nitrous oxide emissions. Our industry has been making big efforts in establishing a nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol. And the idea being that we use the best science available to identify, using the right source, rate, time, and place, using our 4R nutrient stewardship system, to identify methods of growing our crops with fewer nitrous oxide emissions. And the first version of that protocol has already been accepted by the Alberta government, which is the first government to actually recognize tradable carbon protocols for farm use. And we are making efforts to continue and extend that to the rest of North America as well. It's a difficult area. There are a lot of knowledge gaps in that, but we are working towards it. Then the third area, I guess, is the positives as well. If we manage nitrogen correctly in agricultural ecosystems, we can use that nitrogen to build soil organic matter and enhance soil carbon sequestration. And now I'm not one of those that says you just spread nitrogen fertilizer around liberally and it's going to increase soil carbon. I don't believe so. It's in specific targeted ecosystems you can demonstrate that nitrogen has a role in improving soil organic matter. And one example is that there are long-term plots in Kentucky. And the condition is this is corn grown with a cover crop. The winter cover crop is actually the one that absorbs surplus nitrogen in the system, and because it remains in the soil, it actually builds soil carbon. And so there, over a long time period, I believe these plots have been in place since 1970, and they have demonstrated soil organic matter improvement as a result of nitrogen fertilizer use. That doesn't mean it happens everywhere. We have to very carefully be managing our nitrogen fertilizers to get those benefits. So that's my addressing the greenhouse gas question, and it's because we have those other efforts ongoing already that we don't really have a chapter in this book on the direct impacts of human health. Then there were two. Sorry? Food safety. Food safety as well. I've glossed over that part. We intend to have two chapters. One chapter on the mineral fertilizers, one on the organic fertilizers. And with the mineral fertilizers, the food safety risks are mostly related to non-nutritive elements that may accompany some of the mineral fertilizers, and that's particularly related to phosphates. Some elements like cadmium and other elements can be present in phosphate fertilizers. There has been work done in the past by the industry to establish what the safe limits are and outline the size of the issue as well, and that's what the chapter will attempt to do. When it comes to the organic nutrients, we have to look at, in addition to the trace elements, other risks that may be associated with pathogens that may accompany the material, or the more evolving area of endocrine disrupting substances, hormonally active compounds, and those sorts of things, recognizing that, you know, organic nutrients have been used for millennia in farming systems, and there are ways to manage those risks. So that would be my addressing of the question on food safety. I appreciated the comment as well on malaria, and I need to make a clarification there. I did not in any mean way mean to imply that higher rates of nitrogen are going to solve malaria. What I presented that evidence for is that evidence that really, if you want to solve the malaria issue, many countries around the world have shown that it can be done, and it has nothing to do with fertilizer use.
Thank you, Ross. Final word to you, or you're all set? And in the mic. Yeah.
Well, I just one policy issue that was brought to my attention by a former Director General of the AVRDC in Taiwan, Samson Su, at a meeting we held in Salt Lake City in 1995 called Food-Based Approaches to Micronutrient Malnutrition. And he was sitting next to me and says, oh, I know one thing that governments could do around the world. They require every country to have a balance sheet of micronutrients in terms of the what is agriculture in their country producing for all these 42 nutrients? How does that meet the demands of the society for those nutrients? And is there a surplus? Is there a deficiency in any of these nutrients? He says once they had those budget sheets, they could no longer ignore the problem. So it wouldn't, you know, the devil's in the details, and getting countries to produce their own balance sheets, they'd have to know their agricultural production and everything else, and they have the technologies there to do the nutritional analysis. But anyway, I thought that was a bright thing for the guy to say, you know.
And also the power of communication. Once you have that information, to share it and put some pressure. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here to share with us these different perspectives and to create a very interesting dialogue and discussion here. I really hope that in 5, 10, 15 years, we're not going to again keep talking about silos, but we've found some ways in which the fertilizer and the health industry are also talking together. And the World Health Organization welcomes you with open arms very quickly. But thank you very much for taking the time, and please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you very much, Rajul. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.